we are now extremely excited to transition into our keynote discussion here as part of our event today, and are really personally over the moon excited to welcome Miss Michèle Flournoy to speak with us on one of the most significant challenges facing the U.S. Department of Defense today, but also to touch a little bit on potential solutions, right? So not just talking about the problem, but talking about what potentially is on the table that can be done about it. I would argue that this is a conversation that is really of interest to many of you who are out there who are building things and who are interested in potentially providing those capabilities to the Department of Defense, thinking about how to potentially invest in those solutions for DoD, and to better understand the risks and opportunities associated with what Ms. Flournoy has written so extensively about over time and spoken about this notion of the valley of death. So first of all, thank you, Ms. Flournoy, for joining us and making time for this discussion here today.
It's great to be with you, Phil, and I hope that's not the only thing I'm known for in the end. Coining the valley of death term.
Absolutely not. And if I could, yeah, just by way of introduction, I wanted to take a brief moment to let everybody know Ms. Flournoy. She's the co-founder and managing partner at West-Exec Advisors, which is a strategic advisory firm. Chairman of the board at CNAS in Washington, D.C. But I think what's maybe most important here is probably the best boss that I have ever had when she was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Pentagon under President Obama. So really, thank you again, Ms. Flournoy, for being with us here to talk about some of these issues here today. I'll swing right into things and kind of open up with this question of the world in which we find ourselves is constantly changing in terms of technology and how it's disrupting our ecosystem, whether it's in terms of domestic issues or international relations, but in terms of how DoD trains and equips and how it builds out its capabilities and how it thinks about the future, how to invest in that future. And one of the huge challenges as part of that is this notion of the valley of death and what happens to a company that's really interested in bringing up a solution to bear on DoD's problems. So for those who aren't really familiar with what that actually refers to, maybe I could turn to you for some opening comments about what is the valley of death? What is this referring to? And what does it mean for U.S. national security? What sort of risks does it pose? And then we can get going into some of the other questions.
Sure. Well, again, thanks for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So let me start with a little context and then get to the valley of death. So just the moment we are in, we are at a time where the greatest strategic challenge we face is really rising competition with China and Russia, both great powers, very different. But you know, while we have been focused in the 20 years since 9/11 on counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, sort of near-term operations, they've gone to school on the American way of war that was demonstrated in the original Desert Storm, the original Gulf War. And they've spent decades now investing in capabilities to deny our access, to thwart our power of projection, to thwart our effectiveness in their backyards, where they seek to assert influence. And so they're now disturbingly caught up in some areas where we really want to maintain advantage. And so there's a fairly a growing sense of urgency in the department's leadership that if we just kind of stick to our knitting and go forward with the program of record, all of the wargaming reportedly is starting to show that we get into trouble. We aren't able to deter. We don't have decisive victories. You know, we are not prepared for the future, a very different future than the one what we've been dealing with in the last 20 years. So that's the kind of big picture. At the same time, you have this period of profound technological disruption with tremendous innovation happening in quantum computing and AI and directed energy and biotech and so forth. And many of these technologies will have defense and security applications. And so there's that to contend with as well. And so to go after this, when Bob Work and Ash Carter were in office, they really sort of put a focus on the innovation challenge. And the first step was to really enhance the department's network to go out and find where are those non-traditional commercial technology firms that are at the cutting edge of some technology or capability that could be adapted or leveraged for DoD. And they, over the years, through DIU and AFWorks and SoftWorks and all these different channels, we've become fairly good at scouting the landscape and finding, companies who both have something cool and needed and who want to work with the national security enterprise. It's not perfect, but it's certainly, if you're a company and you want to find a foot in the door, there's lots of ways to get the foot in the door. So you've now had some years of companies that have come in the door. They've done some demonstrations, they've done some prototypes, and they're highly successful in that, they win a contest, the operator community wants them, everybody's excited about the capability. But when it comes to jumping from the successful prototype to a production contract that puts them into the program of record, they're told, we don't have the money, we don't have the vehicle, or we can find it for you, but it's going to take 2 to 3 years. That which is like death for a small company that's trying, it's venture funded, their investors are pushing them on, get that ROI, get the profit up, and I want my return on investment sooner than that. And so that's the valley of death. It's the gulf between the successful prototype and a coveted spot in the program of record that's really going to get you to production at scale. And if you zoom, so it's certainly a problem for the companies, but the bigger strategic question is it's a problem for the department, because we aren't, as Eric Schmidt has said recently, we don't have an innovation problem, we have an adoption problem. So we see the innovation, but we can't seem to accelerate the adoption of the innovation at scale to really start transforming both the capabilities we have and how we fight. Ultimately transform the concepts for how we're going to operate in the future to gain advantage and be able to deter effectively and win.
So thank you for kind of laying that out for everyone. For those who are kind of in the innovation ecosystem, they're painfully aware of this, right? And engaging with them on a fairly routine basis, there's a lot of conversation about some of the interim tools that are being brought to bear on the problem. So SBIRs and the various phases that companies can engage in to actually get going, the dollar amounts of which are still relatively, de minimis compared to what is really necessary to stand something up and scale it for what DoD really needs. What are some of the tangible steps that you would propose that can be taken to take some of those, I think, useful steps in the right direction to create a bridge, to take the SBIR example and enhance it, make it even better than what it's trying to accomplish now, or even go a step further?
So I think there's not a single answer, there's a whole bunch of answers. I do think that there are probably, I think the SBIR, the phase 3 approach is really to try to get you, help finance you across that bridge and get into production. It enables matching funds, it enables sole source, it enables a larger amount of money, which starts to become, really interesting and relevant, not just kind of a token investment. So that's one thing, but I think, I do think that the department lacks kind of bridging funds, and we've seen some recommendations to start, a fund that might be allocated, could be within a service. More interesting, I think, is by the Deputy Secretary of Defense to be able to really focus on priority areas where we want to accelerate adoption of a capability, but to sort of have some bridging funds that would continue the to fund the development and refinement of a capability as you're getting it into, the production piece. So that is part of it. I also think honestly, we need to train a subcadre of the acquisition core on agile development, because acquiring a software-defined system or an emerging technology using an agile approach is very different than building an aircraft and keeping it on schedule and on cost and so forth. One has lots of time specifying requirements to the nth decimal point up front, and then this sort of waterfall of cascading milestones, very sequential, very set in stone, versus agile, where you're constantly iterating, refining, improving, sometimes failing, hopefully fast, and then going on and getting better. Takes a totally different risk profile, takes a totally different understanding of how the technology is developed. And so I do think we have to both train and incentivize and give career paths to some portion of our acquisition cadre that really specializes and becomes like the Green Berets of emerging technology acquisition. And then the third idea is that I do think the department needs to try to work with Congress to be allowed to have more of a portfolio management approach. I mean, it's hard to find a major CEO out there that's in the world of, well, it's almost any CEO, but particularly those that are making things or manufacturing or production, where you don't do some kind of quarterly portfolio management, where you take a look at here are the various solutions I have in a particular mission bucket. And some of them are going to be outperforming what you expected. Some are going to be underperforming. You need to have the ability to move money around within a portfolio to double down on, to accelerate something that's promising and offload something that's not working. And if we could create the right oversight for that and the right flexibility for that, that would give the department much more flexibility to make decisions to generate money that could then be applied to something that needs to be accelerated across the valley of death.
So I wanted to ask a little bit about some of the proposals that are out there in terms of innovation funds, et cetera. So the first thing that you mentioned in terms of potential solutions, the thing that grabs me is this conversation has been going on for some time, so that, for instance, the subcadre that you referred to in terms of the acquisition system and how to really kind of shift the way that the thinking is away, toward risk. Is that happening, or is that something that's still kind of being discussed? And I think one of the things that I've grappled with here is, and you speak about it in the various pieces that you've written over the last year plus, and spoken about that conversation between DoD and Congress about what's needed and how to get there and create that flexibility that you referred to. So for those who are listening in, who are as part of these companies that are building capabilities they want to get into the system, is it happening? Is it moving in that direction, or is it still kind of nascent?
There have been some examples, through leadership and force of personality. So, I think when Will Roper was in the Air Force, he created a huge amount of pressure for the acquisition corps to move faster, to basically take years out of the Air Force acquisition program. And he provided top cover, he provided direction, he pushed and he used all of his authority to enable that. But I'm not aware that I don't think it's been sort of systematized. I mean, will that continue now that Will has departed? Similarly with Hondo Geurts, he really tried to use his position in the Navy acquisition side to, sort of show people how it could be done. So for example, I understand that he created an Acquisition Officer of the Year award, and he gave it to someone who had actually overseen an agile process where the first attempt failed, but they learned quickly and the second one was very successful. So he held this person up and said, hey, here's a different kind of model of behavior, and this is what I'm looking for. But again, that's not systemic. So what I'm talking about is actually identifying a separate like MOS, military specialty, training, giving people particular training on how to work with agile development, software-defined systems, commercial tech, giving them an opportunity to do those jobs repeatedly over the life of a career, a different career path, and incenting and rewarding them for, behaving differently, accepting risk differently, and all of that. I do not believe that has not happened. And I think that's really, we've got to get beyond, being lucky to have a great leader in a great spot for a while and having that improvement be felt to something that's systemic and that's going to be enduring. Because this is, DoD is a massive organization, and we do not have a lot of time to waste at this point.
Is that something that you feel that the deputy secretary and the vice can potentially collaborate on making happen, or is that something that?
So, and if someone like Mike Brown is confirmed as Undersecretary for Acquisition, I mean, he understands this world, and he's got charge of the acquisition workforce. I certainly hope he'll take something like this on.
Yeah. So back to the funding, the question in many ways comes down to how are you going to pay for it? So it's got to come. So budgets are not going to be increasing. Mm-hmm. If we're talking about creating new resources that can go toward this bridge, your sense of where does that have to come from? How does Congress begin to think about how do you set up something like, for instance, what's currently being discussed with the Warfighter Innovation Fund? You put $100 million into that bucket. As we think about the trade-offs, right? Yeah.
I think initially it's actually like in DoD terms, where we talk about billions. I mean, I think you could have a very strong impact with, several $100 million. You could prove pilot the program itself, prove it out, and then grow it over time with the appropriate oversight. But I also think more broadly, I really, one other thing I've talked a lot about is getting the department to place some big bets. And what I mean by that is to telegraph to the tech sector and to industry, look, we know that, AI is going, by the way, read the National Security Commission on AI if you haven't already memorized it. It's the most important commission report since the 9/11 Commission. It's really, really important. But, okay, take AI. We are going to place a big bet on AI, and we as the Department of Defense intend to spend $10 billion, whatever the billion, over, X billion dollars over Y years. And here's how we're going to structure the effort. And here's how the series of gating competitions is going to work. So you draw people in with some serious money on the table, and then you use competition to, find the best ones and start really moving towards specific RFPs and contracts. But without that sort of overall big bet signal, very hard to get commercial tech to come to the table if they think they're just going to kind of forever be stuck in the world of small OTAs or SBIRS contracts or whatever. So, and I think we know enough about the nature of the future fight to identify some of those big bets today.
The interesting piece of this, as we think about the evolving battle space, we think about the trajectory of all of the integration of all of these various capabilities and what that's going to look like. Kind of the convergence of these various things. You mentioned AI. It makes me think of, how we can think of this in the contested space as it is, right? Not necessarily thinking about just the great power conflict challenge, but thinking about the fact that a lot of what's happening just today is well below the threshold of real, open conflict, and thinking about irregular warfare. And, AI doesn't exactly solve gray zone conflict, right? It's a set of tools.
But there are applications that can help you there as well. And I'm not saying AI is like the magic bullet. I'm just using it. What AI can do is, in a world where we are going to be more and more awash in information and data, it helps separate the wheat from the chaff and put together the insight and give it to the decision maker to say, this is the small percentage of all this data that you need to pay attention to inform your decision. And if we can do that faster and more accurately than the other guy, we're going to have an advantage. So
it gets to something that you've written about extensively, which is something that I am very much seized with in terms of the operational concepts that must accompany these sorts of capabilities. I think somebody you know, Chris Doherty at CNAS, I think he wrote a piece just today that talks about how DoD, in terms of thinking about the systems that we're looking to deploy, whether it's these broadly networked capabilities, JADC2 and what have you, we need to be ready to be punched in the face, as he put it in his article today. Thinking about how you prepare for that from an operational concepts perspective, how well is DoD positioned at this point? You've got a totally new team in place. They're bringing a level of energy to this. They're thinking about structure and approaching strategic level problems like this. How do you actually begin to develop the operational concepts necessary within the building to really actually prepare to integrate these kinds of capabilities, whether it be AI or further out into things we don't really see yet, quantum, et cetera? But how do you begin to get ahead of that from an operational concepts perspective?
Well, I do think, having an overall concept like JAD, joint all domain command and control, with the notion that we have to assume that our networks are and our data and information flows, our command and control, are going to be constantly disrupted. You're going to gain communications, you're going to lose it, you're going to gain access, you're going to lose it. And it's going to be like hopefully better than our electrical grid that's under attack, but that there's enough network capability to reroute parts of the system. When parts of the system go down, you can still reroute, but that there's also a lot of processing power at the edge and decision making at the edge, even when a unit is disconnected from headquarters, and they're still able to operate and carry out the mission. So there's all kinds of pieces. There's conceptual work. There's training people how to go in and out of having true command and control above them versus now I'm on my own, sort of operating without that, and I'm going to transition back and forth between that all the time. But I think what the department needs to do is set the big idea, but not try to deduce the answers from top down. This is not a typical joint staff, everybody at the table, let's all come to consensus. This is a let's get out there and let lots of teams compete concepts and see what works, and experiment within the field, try it out, refine it, experiment again, bring it back, compete it against something else. And eventually from that bottom-up process, have the ability to sort of bring to the senior folks, when real resource allocations required, the question, either, do you want to choose of these three concepts? Do you want to choose a winner and say this one's best and other ones, nice try, good job, but go away? We're not going to invest in your answer. Or is this a place where we will really need redundancy and resilience, or this is going to so complicate the other guy's attack planning that we want all of these solutions and we're going to fund all of them? And so the most important thing for this team to do right now is to structure and incentivize that competition. And it's really critical that it's rank agnostic, it's service agnostic. Like if you're on a team and you're the most junior person in the world and you have the best idea, you still get to, speak up, put your idea on the table and have that carry the day. So it has to be a structured competition. And I do think there's pockets of this going on, little mini versions of this within the services. Certainly the Marine Corps has done a lot of this down at McCitic. The Army's trying to do it down at Futures Command. I mean, the Air Force is doing pieces of it. So, there's this ferment, and you actually want to support and enable that. I mean, one more comment on, since I haven't touched on the Navy, I've had naval historians say, look, back in the day when the battleship was king, even though the Navy was totally bought into preserving that, as their approach, they consciously allowed an insurgency to grow inside the Navy that was pushing for aviation and naval aviation as being the transforming capability of the future. And you think back on history, had they not allowed that insurgency to happen, we might have been really in even worse shape when we got into World War II. So this kind of fostering this conceptual competition is one of the most important things that the civilian and military leadership can do right now.
I think as someone who had the real unique opportunity to be in OSD when you were there, one of the things that you and Jim Millen and others really pushed for was, as an organization, thinking about it from a cultural perspective. Something that you're speaking to there is really, it's a cultural shift. It's something that the DIB highlighted in terms of its software process. It's a mindset, and there are, like you said, there's pockets of this happening, but really it's a massive cultural shift that needs to take place within DoD in order to get to a place. How much of that is, you mentioned that it's kind of diffuse and then maybe even bottom up a little bit. How much of that is going to be top down in terms of really pushing for that cultural shift to be able to be ready for this kind of change?
Yeah, no, I think you have to create the leadership environment or the climate where people can take the risk to break doctrine, think out of the box, question the orthodoxy. So absolutely, and I see, that coming from at least two of the chiefs are doing that and trying to drive that kind of ferment forward. We'll do a quiz at the end, and you can guess which two of the four they are. But it does mean, because I really do think a lot of the people who are at the top of the services, they presided over a very different, strategic set of challenges of the last 20 years. It's the people who are coming into leadership as field grade officers today and as younger, 1 and 2 stars. This is going to be their career, and they have will have the fire in the belly, I think, to get after it in a way that is just, going to be very exciting to them. I think I don't think this is hard to motivate the younger leaders coming up to wrestle with this stuff, because this is going to be their reality, not Afghanistan and Iraq and counterterrorism necessarily.
I think one of the things that often comes to mind in these conversations for us, and something I was very interested in asking you about, was, even within that, the DIB effort to look at the software question and to provide recommendations for the building. You look at Stratcom's effort to modernize NC3. You look at it through a number of different lenses, and you see this kind of really on a broader push to adopt industry standards in terms of development
to the cloud. That's another example.
Yep. Yep. So as we do this, something that strikes me as someone who likes to kind of look back at the history of how innovation has happened within DoD. You'll look at the things that happened at Skunk Works, the things that happened down in Silicon Valley, but also in other elements of the ecosystem. How is it that that we can push for those sorts of standards, which really, they create problems within industry as it is, and that, for instance, DevSecOps, this culture that gets pushed for, is pretty tough even for the best that are out there. How does DoD get to the point where it's not so much playing catch up, where it's like, oh, great, industry's doing really well at DevSecOps, we should adopt that, and be in a point where we've got the ingenuity, we've got the creativity, we've got the expertise and the resources to be one step ahead of that, instead of kind of always being like, let's adopt those industry best practices and catch up. And I think the curious thing that crosses my mind, for instance, is you think about the NC3 superstructure, you don't necessarily want to just be reliant on just outside thinking. You got to have a lot of that creativity coming from within. So curious as to how you see that interplay, and how DoD can really be an innovator on its own, a leader on its own, instead of just looking to industry for best practices.
Yeah, no, I think some of the most exciting innovation efforts have been when we've managed to form teams that bring in the operators, the kind of program overseers, and the technologists or industry from the outside, and they are cycling as a team together on these things. It tends right now to happen at a smaller scale projects with a non-traditional industry partner and relatively small amounts of money. But I do think that, you know, you get the mission intimacy and real understanding of what will work and what won't work in a battlefield environment, combined with the, like, you know, the expertise on authorities and color of money and, you know, how do I actually make this go from the program side, and then the real sort of cutting edge of the technology piece from the outside. And, you know, I think that's something that we have to try to build on more and scale. I do think, you know, just moving as much as we can towards open mission systems and not having kind of any kind of vendor lock, but always allowing kind of best software to win, you know, no matter where it's coming from, best in class technology to win, to be integrated in. But it's a very different model. And I do think this business model piece is the hardest part for DoD. I mean, and it's slow, it takes time. I mean, you had Ellen Lord, you know, depart by leaving the department with a very good piece of work on how to acquire software. But, you know, the department is incredibly slow at training people on how to do it, building the capacity, actually putting the process into practice, and wrestling some of these issues to the ground. So
one of the questions that we've got from the audience, and I'll open up to some of the Q&A that's coming in, is this. You mentioned China at the outset. You mentioned kind of, you know, pacing threats, the ability for civil military fusion on their end to, honestly, to maybe even move past those sorts of constraints that we face, where you have some of that innovation that's happening that's really kind of separate from the national security establishment here in the United States, and very intentionally and very, I think, in a good way. They don't work that way. It's almost mandatory to a certain extent with some of these organizations to have to plug it back into the national security effort. How do you see that in terms of the competition and what the United States can be doing? I mean, at the end of the day, there's a balancing that needs to occur here, so that, you know, as China continues to move forward and mature, that it doesn't result in a disruptive moment where the conflict is almost inevitable. How does, as they have that civil military fusion capability or approach, how does the United States compete with that, as they really have a different way of approaching the solution?
I mean, the civil military future is a systemic source of advantage for them, no question, because the military can put their hands into anything that looks interesting from their commercial or state-owned enterprises sector. But our traditional advantage, we have sources of advantage that I wouldn't trade for that. One is our innovation ecosystem, which is just always going to be far more on the cutting edge of, you know, well, if we play our cards right and we continue to make the right investments, it will keep us on the cutting edge of innovation. We also have a tremendous advantage in our people, in terms of their operational experience and grounding in real world operations, and their conceptual creativity if they're given the room to do that. You know, if they're really incentivized and rewarded and encouraged to be creative and be you know, problem solvers. And you put those two things together, we should, you know, I wouldn't trade our position for that of China, right? But we've got to be playing our cards right. And that's where I do think more work on this conceptual piece, more breaking down the barriers, the obstacles for the best commercial tech to come into the department. That's where we have to focus, you know, our attention going forward.
So some of the questions that are coming in, they move a little bit further afield than what we've been talking about in terms of the Valley of Death, but it is in keeping with the theme that we were just on. The question of how to how to think about this and how to approach it, seeing that some of our most innovative companies are actually fairly inextricably linked with, their growth is linked with China. And you see this in terms of the news last week, in terms of some of the data localization issues that some of our companies face, right? The decisions they have to make as, balancing human rights and profits and thinking about this. But how do you see and this is a question from the audience, how do you compete with China when some of our largest, most innovative companies are actually inextricably linked with China?
So I think this is going to be true not just for tech companies, it's true for major manufacturers where, you look at the aviation industry and, China is growing its commercial airline capacity faster than any other country in the world. And a huge portion of future revenues for any US company involved in that value chain is coming from the Chinese commercial market. So I think that it's not a either or. I think the question is, how do you help these companies develop ability to navigate responsibly, a risk management and mitigation approach so that they can turn and honestly look the US government in the eye and say, we understand what you hold dear, we understand what is sensitive and cannot be shared, and these are all the things we're doing to make sure that we don't have any deliberate or inadvertent sharing of technology or IP that would, be of military value, would be of concern to you. And at the same time, we are engaging with China in the following ways. And look how many US jobs it's creating. Look how much it's contributing to the GDP. And so part of this is a big chunk of business for West-Exec, is a number of these companies who feel like they're walking in a minefield every day have found us to say, can you help us build an internal risk management process and a strategy for walking this line and understanding where each side is going and making sure we don't, have an explosion every day, But I think this is a huge problem, and it speaks to I think decoupling is a terrible idea. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it's in our interests. I don't think it's necessary. But instead of taking a sledgehammer to the interdependency, take a scalpel, carve out the things that you really need to protect them exceedingly well, and otherwise allow the normal trade flows to happen that frankly benefit us economically in many cases.
So entirely shifting gears, some of the other questions that are coming in are harking back to something we were talking about a moment ago. I'll go with the one that just came through. It's an interesting question. How do we ensure we're valuing and implementing the institutional memory of senior leaders while simultaneously encouraging that next generation of talent to actually innovate and depart from older models of approach and thinking?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I do think having those senior leaders be everything from, sort of framers of the problem and describers of what we really need to look for, here are lessons learned from my experience, kind of, creating the context and the design for the competition based on all of that experience and knowledge. And then letting some of the, younger, innovative, creative folks, not that older people can't be innovative and creative, but, letting the younger folks have at it. But then coaching them, helping assess what they do, what they come up with, mentoring, coaching. I mean, I think there is a way to blend this, and frankly, to have mixed groups. So you've got people of different ranks and experience level and specialty areas, but where rank really doesn't determine who gets to speak first or last or most loudly.
We've got another one that's a little bit tangential to where we just were. It has to do with about cyber in terms of how well the services are positioned to deal with, as you think about cyber and EW, can the department actually move fast enough to keep up with the trends that we're seeing in adversarial nations like China and Russia? So I think that's really getting at the question. It goes back to some of what we were talking about.
Yeah.
Are we able to adapt fast enough?
Yeah, I mean, I think we we're definitely improving our ability, our ability to collect and understand threat intelligence. I think we've been building the human capacity we need through a combination of both people in uniform, people in career service, but also contractors and supporters from the outside. I think it's really important to keep an open channel to the cutting edge of commercial cyber industry because, again, I am seeing at West-Exec every day solutions that, that are eye-watering to the U.S. military that they had no idea existed. And so we've got to keep leveraging that cutting edge and finding ways to bring it in and integrate it into our cyber capabilities. And so it's a it's a journey. You're never going to sort of say, okay, now I'm secure and I'm done. It's always going to be this cat and mouse kind of thing. And we just have to make sure that we're bringing together not only the best talent in the department, but also from outside. And there's a huge human capital piece to this in terms of really attracting and bringing in more digital talent, at least for short tours, if not for some kind of auxiliary reserves to augment the force. That's going to be key in the future as well. Can I just say one more thing on this notion of keeping leader expertise? And it's just a small point. Yeah. When you look at periods of innovation, one of the key things that's been helped is when you have a senior leader who is driving change, keeping them in place for more than 2 to 3 years, which is the normal cycle time in the military. So look at Rickover. I don't know how many decades was he the head of the Navy nuclear program, but he drove that for years and years and years. And I do think we have to question how quickly we constantly cycle people through if we're going to really get transformational change in a given area.
Cultural shifts within the system, right? This is incredibly challenging. I think the piece that we often talk about is you mentioned eye-watering capabilities, and it goes right back to what we started talking about. How do you actually have a system that can move fast enough to get those capabilities to the warfighter and to the services? Couple of questions that are coming in. We're coming up. We've got a couple of minutes left here. What are some of the benchmarks that DoD puts in place or can use to monitor bridging the gap and closing the valley of death? It's an interesting question. Is there a way that, yeah?
I think we want to start tracking successes and failures, like, how many, what percentage or how many of the prototypes actually make it across. Now, we're going to, prototype is a prototype. So there are lots of prototypes that shouldn't cross into production, right?
Sure.
But of the ones we want to cross in, where you've actually got an interested customer who wants to get it, how long does it take? How hard is it to do? How, track the time. One of the things that Will Roper did in the Air Force that changed behavior is he made time the ultimate metric. And, moving fast was rewarded, and cutting years out of the timeline was rewarded. And when people really understand that and they see it impact their own, recognition, standing, opportunities, promotion, they start behaving differently. So, there can be, you have to worry about unintended consequences, sure, for any set of metrics you choose. But I do think really tracking, how much is getting across the valley of death? How long is it taking? What are the solutions that are making that crossing possible? What things are consistently failing and why? Really starting to keep some data on this.
So much work to do. We've got about a minute left here. I'll take that to pose the final question that came in. And I know this is something that you have thought about and you've led on, that you care deeply about. The question is, shifting the command culture through senior leadership education is one thing. How do we enable this type of mindset in those who are coming in, who have just taken the oath? How do you begin to inculcate that with your brand new members of the force, this sort of thinking that really does put us further out into the 21st century?
I think it comes down to who is getting recognized and who is getting promoted. And if you start promoting the people who are, breaking the orthodoxy, breaking China, coming up with taking the risk, coming up with the innovative solution, it sends a signal. It sends a signal. I remember when we started the strategy office back in the Clinton administration, restarted it. I went to each of the chiefs. I said, please don't send me anybody who's not going to make it to flag or general officer, because I want this office. It's very important that this office be seen as on the promotion track to flag. I'd rather do without than not give me someone who's a fast flyer. And it became exactly that. And that it became a talent magnet, for all of its days. It still is today. So that it's, those are the signals that people read. And so sending, helping to, it's really how are you taking care of and rewarding and holding up the people who are exhibiting the behaviors you want. And if you do that well enough, others will get the message pretty quickly and say, okay, that's what I want to do. And you'll create a whole following and a cadre and a movement, if you will. So
institutionalizing those incentive structures. That utterly makes sense. And as someone who, again, had the pleasure of being able to work for you, I saw you doing that as a leader. So thank you, Ms. Flournoy, for taking the time to speak with us here today on this incredibly challenging set of issues. We really genuinely appreciate your time.
It's great conversation, and good to see you, Phil. And congratulations to you for what you've created, with your institution and the great conversations that you're leading out there. So
thank you. It's it's a growth industry. Thank you very much. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it. Thank you, ma'am.